Any GOAT conversation in relation to MMA is going to spring up a wide variety of questions, answers, and candidates whose names rise to the top. But for this video, we will do our best to make this conversation as straightforward as possible. We have several GOAT candidates and 7 distinct criteria by which to judge them. We'll circle back to the ultimate question at the very end of this video. But for now, let's take a dive in and see what springs up. Longest undefeated run. Straight off the bat, we're getting into some heavy territory. The longest winning streak in UFC history belongs, of course, to the great Anderson Silva, who, including his non-title debut in the UFC, won 16 consecutive fights, either defending his middleweight belt or taking random fights up at 205 pounds. Kamaru Usman comes in with 15 in second place, which 5 different fighters managed to score 13 victories, including GOAT candidates Khabib Nurmagomedov, George St. Pierre, Jon Jones, and Demetrious Johnson. But here's where it gets interesting. If Jon Jones's lone career loss against Matt Hamill by DQ never happened, then he would, in fact, hold a 17-fight win streak in the promotion up until his no contest against Daniel Cormier. And on the other hand, had his TKO victory over Cormier not been overturned, Jones would be currently riding a 19-fight win streak within the UFC. If we're talking specifically about an unbeaten run, if both his DQ loss and that no contest against DC were not in play, Jon would have a totally undefeated 23-fight UFC career. There are a few asterisks here, but it's clear that Jon Jones is in a league of his own when it comes to his ability to win consistently at the highest level. Success across multiple divisions. The term pound for pound gets thrown around a lot these days, especially now that MMA has officially moved into its champ-champ era. Thanks for that, Connor. But as far as the GOAT conversation goes, it's an important point to consider. Candidates like George St. Pierre, Jon Jones, and Henry Cejudo, they all won belts in the division above them. And though Anderson Silva never challenged for 205-pound gold out of respect for his friend Jon Jones, he moved up in weight 3 times during his title reign and finished all 3 opponents in the first round. Even Demetrious Johnson, who was clearly undersized at bantamweight, holds an 18-3 career record at 135 pounds, a run that he is continuing on to this day, fighting and beating larger opposition in one championship. Unfortunately for any Khabib fans out there, this is definitely the Eagle's weakest area, and a point that he often gets criticized for. So, who had the greatest impact in the division above them? Well, you cannot deny what GSP and Jones were able to do in one night at middleweight and heavyweight respectively. And, looking ahead, Jon will no doubt continue to build on his heavyweight legacy. But is it better to beat a high-level fighter and win the belt, or do the multiple appearances from guys like Cejudo, Silva, and Mighty Mouse get the nod? We'll leave that one up to you, but having multi-divisional success is definitely a big one, folks. Technical skill. Who is actually the greatest martial artist we have ever seen inside the cage? Having a killer resume is one side of the discussion, but which fighter truly brought us the highest levels of MMA we've had the pleasure of witnessing? This is definitely a big component of Khabib Nurmagomedov's claim. No fighter in his 13 UFC fights could really stand up to his insanely technical approach to offense. He made great fighters look like total amateurs in there. Demetrious Johnson was often criticized for ruling a division that was subpar, but I think it's pretty clear now that Mighty Mouse was simply that much better than his adversaries. And towards the end of his run, he really started to flex. Jon Jones might just be the most naturally talented fighter to have ever graced the sport, a technical fighter, yes, but also a supremely gifted athlete who proved his continuing superiority over a decade later by literally steamrolling through Cyril Gane at heavyweight. George St. Pierre is another guy, definitely falls into that category of special talent. And for years, he had an unbeatable aura to him, like he was just miles ahead of the competition. And then you have Anderson Silva, who had some moments that just seemed like they were pulled from a movie script. His reign was magical, and he had the moments to show for it. So, who brought us the highest levels of MMA we've ever seen? Well, You could say Khabib did it against the modern lightweight division, which is probably well up there in terms of all-time great divisions. Jon Jones and GSP are very easy to point to here because of their well-rounded games, and Demetrious Johnson might actually be the most technically sound fighter to ever do it. Our vote might just lean towards Khabib here, but only barely. Clean testing record. This next section is pretty self-explanatory. If you pop for PEDs, depending on who you ask, this can be a real make or break for your GOAT claim. And out of the candidates we have, both Jon Jones and Anderson Silva have had run-ins with the USADA. Your own mileage may vary on this section as part of your criteria, so proceed in whatever way suits you. But as far as we know, and yes, we understand that drug tests are not always a reliable way to know exactly who is cheating, but Demetrious Johnson, George St. Pierre, Jose Aldo, and Khabib Nurmagomedov can all point to squeaky clean USADA records. Do with that information what you will. Depth of title reign. Beating members of the generation that came before you or your own contemporaries is almost a requirement if you're going to become a champion. But when you start to pick off the prospects who made their rise, knowing that they will one day get in there with you, the longtime champion, that's where a title reign gets really tricky. Demetrious Johnson was able to do it, beating several eras worth of contenders before losing his belt. Jon Jones also pulled it off, although he definitely had some real trouble with the likes of Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes. GSP also stuck around long enough to see some newer threats make their rise, although he did decide to leave the sport on his own terms. Khabib, on the other hand, never really stuck around long enough to test himself against those who had climbed into the sport gunning for his belt. And Anderson Silva, though his reign was a long one, mainly fought his contemporaries right up until he ran into Chris Weidman, the first truly new school fighter he faced. Given that Jon Jones literally just won the heavyweight title against an undeniably modern fighter in Cyril Gane, you could give the nod to him here. But GSP and Mighty Mouse really did extend their title reigns and take on a wide range of talents, going from young sensations to hardened veterans, welcoming all challenges that may rise up. Scalp collectors, legacy stealers. Out of all the primary candidates we have, who managed to beat the most former champions? Or, to take another angle on it, who has the single best victory on their resume? Well, Khabib, for example, beat one former champion in Conor McGregor, but he also took out some divisional legends in Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and the future champ, Rafael dos Anjos. For Jon Jones, the best opponent he ever faced was probably Daniel Cormier, but in beating Shogun Rua, Rashad Evans, Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, and Vitor Belfort, he brings his champion count up to 6, and those are only some of his great victories. George St. Pierre beat probably the most distinguished champion of anyone here when he dominated Matt Hughes in their rematch to pry the belt away from him. Hughes at the time had a total of 7 title defenses, and he was already seen as the sport's greatest ever champion. He also beat Matt Serra, BJ Penn, and the longtime Strikeforce champion Nick Diaz. Anderson Silva took out the former Pride 2-weight world champion Dan Henderson, Vitor Belfort, Forrest Griffin, Rich Franklin, and the former Strikeforce king Nate Marquardt. Demetrious Johnson was so dominant that he almost made his competition look lackluster, but guys like Kyojo Horiguchi, Joseph Benavidez, and Henry Cejudo were all finished by his hand, and they're certainly world-class, championship-level fighters. This category is easy to score in favor of Jon Jones. He went on a legend-killing run that really had no equal in the sport. Popularity. And finally, we come to a section that might not seem that important, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Stardom and overall popularity aren't exactly the be-all and end-all of a GOAT candidate's claim, but guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov and Anderson Silva, who had some real blockbuster fights under their belt, yeah, that's one way to ensure your legacy. These were not just massive pay-per-views, they were cultural moments within the sport. Jon Jones and GSP were no slouches in this department either, with each man bringing a very consistent level of pay-per-view attention during their best years. As much as the hardcores know what's up, Demetrius Johnson could never really find any success in this area, leaving the UFC behind him in favor of a move to one championship. If the GOAT conversation was a popularity contest, then Conor McGregor would win it hands down. But all these guys are iconic in one way or another. The global superstardom of Khabib, the legendary highlight reel of Silva, the crossover appeal and national hero-dom of GSP, the notoriety of Jon Jones. Conclusion. Any GOAT conversation is going to come down to personal preference. Do you prefer seeing a champion who can hold onto a belt for an insanely long amount of time? A guy like Mighty Mouse or George St. Pierre? Or is it all about the levels of fighter shows, the peaks they manage to reach at any given time? In that case, you're probably a fan of the Eagle, Khabib Nurmagomedov. If moments of pure magic are what you look for, no one did it quite like Anderson Silva. But for our money, when you take all possible criteria into consideration, Jon Jones's ability to bring technical innovation, longevity, multi-divisional success, with one hell of a resume to show for it, yeah, it's very easy to point to the UFC's youngest ever champion as the greatest of all time. But hey, that's just our opinion. Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.